Talks beget talks and more talks. After acquiring a name at last, the national dialogue is being subjected to dialogue. And Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua thinks the talks about dialogue are headed nowhere. And talking of heading nowhere, where is Cabinet Secretary for Sports Ababu Namwamba headed? There are more talks on that end. On the memo, it is a happy birthday to Jamila, who is away tonight. On my take, I talk, pun intended, about Kenya's electoral management story, which may well be headed nowhere. And I borrowed that. Sam Sense talks sense into the anti-corruption statistics and how Kenyans are waiting for the war on corruption to graduate from storytelling. Kai Kai's Kicker is talking too. And this time, it is the culture of scamming that is now taking root. Is it time to inaugurate the Republic of Scammers? The talking edition of the News Gang is here.
Mazungumzo yanaendelea inaongozwa na Mheshimiwa Kalonzo. Hapo hakuna kitu mngoje. There is nothing for you to eat from there. 2018 Raila alienda handshake na Uhuru Kenyatta. Hakumwambia Kalonzo. Hakuenda na yeye. Akaenda akatengeneza deal yake na Uhuru Kenyatta wakamalizana. Project zote alitoa kwa Uhuru akapeleka kwao. Kuna project alienda kwa Ukambani? Lakini nyinyi hata hatuelewi nyinyi. Baada ya kufanyia nyinyi hiyo tena mkamfuata tena mkaamuka na yeye.
And indeed, it is that cold water that's being thrown on a process that is yet to begin, that actually officially begins tomorrow, that is Friday. Gentlemen, welcome to the conversation. Sam, so we're talking about the talks that we don't think will go anywhere even before they have officially began. We're doing a lot of talking in this country, and it's not just the Deputy President, but you've hosted quite a few other leaders on your shows this week that are also talking about this talk that is apparently not quite useful, according to some of them.
Yeah, and you wonder what to believe, because you have two teams that have come together with a list of agenda. And the team that has been appointed by both sides has sat down and incorporated a technical team to look into the agenda of the two sides and advise them on what exactly they should be talking about. Then a lot of cold water, or is it just water, coming from different sides?
It's very cold water.
Very cold water. Just wondering what happens to water in a place that is a bit hot, like Mwala. So you wonder what the essence is, because I do not think those comments are idle. And the Deputy President himself even said that, I am telling you, and you'll be hearing that, I am telling you as the Deputy President. But I also take note that I have had that before, because I think the president now, when he was the Deputy President, used to use that phrase that I'm telling you as the Deputy President of Kenya. So for him to go ahead in a funeral in Mwala, which is in Machakos County, to tell the people of Ukambani that indeed one Kalonzo Musyoka leading the talks, there's nothing to expect from there, I find it peculiar. What is it trying? Is it trying to craft a campaign position against the conversation? Because we've seen that enough going on, especially in Mount Kenya regional areas that really voted for the Kenya Kwanza administration. We've seen the president himself in parts of Nakuru, in parts of central Kenya. Whenever he goes there, you hear him saying that you cannot continue to talk to people that wanaleta maandamano. But then again, even when I speak to leaders who have come to the morning show here, you hear them saying of how surprised they are for the Deputy President to speak the way he did. I was speaking to the Member of Parliament for Kitui Central, that is Dr. Makali Mulu, and him saying that he felt insulted because you hear and the Deputy President is sort of lecturing the community. So then you wonder, even if Kimani Ichung'wah himself has said that whatever is happening out there is not going to interfere with what is going on at the national dialogue. What is the mood of the entire administration that Kenya Kwanza is, if this is the sort of conversation going on?
Yeah, and before we bring you in, Linus, you know, as Sam is saying, there have been many other voices that have been saying this. I mean, granted, you know, it is the deputy president, which is at the highest level, I mean, literally, you know, second in command, that is throwing cold water on this. But we did hear from other leaders, like you mentioned on your show. This was something that was actually said by Ndindi Nyoro, the member of parliament for Kiharu, who had actually started out by saying this. And I think in the beginning, that was when we heard the two co-chairs of the National Dialogue team saying, well, we're not going to listen to what's happening outside. But let's listen to Ndindi Nyoro, because it seems like it was a build-up from what he said.
Wadosi hawa wetu kabisa wananchi waliongea August last year, na wakasema huyu ndiye ataongoza, na wakasema mwingine atakuwa leader of opposition ama atafanya kazi ya kucheck wale wamechaguliwa. Kwa hivyo with no doubt and with certainty, me as Ndindi Nyoro and the people of Murang'a, the people of Kiharu, the people of Kenya, we are pleading that tomorrow as the talks resume, the first agenda should be actually to terminate the talks. Tunasema sasa tuachane na hii mazungumzo. Mazungumzo inatupeleka wapi? Tuendelee na maneno ya kazi ya kujenga barabara, kazi ya kuweka maji, maneno ya kuongea. Sisi hatuungi mkono, tuachane nayo, tutembelee na kujenga Kenya yetu.
And so the build-up started from his sentiments and then to the deputy president. But Linus, it is perhaps he who understands where the shoe pinches, because when we were at this point in 2018, when there were talks between President Uhuru Kenyatta at the time and Raila Odinga, there was one person who clearly was left out of the talks until the very last minute. I think, and that is something that is on record because he has said it as well, finding out just when those in the media were also getting a call that, you know, rushed to Harambee House on the steps that there was a major announcement afoot. So he would know. He would know just what, you know, a dicey position this would be based on history.
Yes, and talking of history, Yvonne, political deal making comes with burnt offerings. There has to be something on the table. What are you offering? And it has to be burnt. It has to be destroyed. Burning is really bad. Go as recently as 2018, March 9th. What are the consequences of the handshake? The consequences of the handshake were such that Deputy President William Ruto at the time had to be sidelined because there is a new deal between Raila Odinga and then President Uhuru Kenyatta. If you go further down our history again, when there is a political deal between, when there was a political deal between President Moi in the late 90s, now towards the 2002 election, it was to the disadvantage of the political opposition because, and I want to divide this into regions. There are three regions that really form the troika of power in this country. There is Mount Kenya region, there is the Rift Valley, and there's the Lake region. Actually, they all happen to be interesting geographical features. Mm-hmm. There's the mountain, there's a lake, and there's a valley.
Yeah.
Now, there's something that oddly plays out every time there's this political deal making. And I always give the example of a two-seater rickshaw or two-seater plane where you have three interested parties. But this can only take a maximum of two. And that has been the case with our politics. This explains the jitters that we are seeing from Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua. When you see Kenya Kwanza talking of handshake, they are defining the handshake in exactly the same sense as what Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga did. Because the moment they shook their hands, there were political consequences. 4 years in the wilderness for Deputy President then William Ruto. So Rigathi Gachagua's instincts are right also, because you don't know what comes out of such political deal making. I think there was a part where he was talking about Raila Odinga going to meet the president in Mombasa, and I would like us to just play that bit where he went to Mombasa and met President Ruto without Kalonzo Musyoka.
Ile mazungumzo Kalonzo wametumwa, hakuna kitu hapo ya kuzungumza. Raila tayari atasema mambo yake, alimalizia Mombasa. Hii ni mambo tu ya kuzungusha wa Kenya. There is nothing.
We don't know if there is nothing. We don't know if there is anything. But what we know is, just like in 2018, March 9th, the deputy president was not present when such a conversation took place. So in terms of political instincts, in my view, the deputy president's instincts are in the right place. You need to watch that. Where is that going? What if it transforms into something else? And remember, our politics are constructed around regional blocks. And either of the two blocks has always been enough to claim political power. So you can see that the base of the deputy president is saying, no, not in a hurry, we are good. But I want to come to the second bit of the Kenya Kwanza base. When you look at both President Ruto and even Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua, when they speak in areas that are perceived to have voted heavily for them, the message to the base has always been, no handshake, no, we don't want, we decided this election. For the simple reason that the framing of these talks has always been about continuation of the dispute over the last election results. You have Azimio claiming you never won. Open the server, one of the issues that you need to address. Lately, that has mellowed. So when they speak to their base, they're telling them, no, we won the election. And I think we started with that bite of the deputy president saying, and Ndindi Nyoro saying, it was resolved in August last year. Today, speaking in Nyandarua, President Ruto also repeated that the election was resolved in August last year. It's been more than a year now since the 9th of August. And what does this also say? Azimio, the opposition coalition, comes to the negotiating table with less strength in terms of a political argument than any other previous talks that they've had of this kind. You know, in 2018, 2019, the grievance around the elections was palpably strong. Remember, the first round of the election was nullified by the Supreme Court. And then there was a second run, which was a solo run by President Uhuru Kenyatta, who got about 90-something% of the election. So in a way, there was some legitimacy to the argument that the last election had questions. But in this particular one, there's one thing that Kenya Kwanza administration is making clear. Read the results.
And not only that, the Supreme Court decision affirmed their win.
Yes, wasn't that completed? So the electoral argument is going to be a weak point and a weak argument for the Azimio coalition. Which
is probably why we haven't heard much talk about opening the servers, because remember, that was something that was the big pushing point for the Azimio La Umoja One Kenya coalition, and it was open the server, open the server, open the server. And that has since morphed into other regions, other conversations, including the cost of living, and now, of course, the reconstitution of the electoral management body. And, you know, just to add on, you know, at the time, there was a huge legitimacy question for President Uhuru Kenyatta's tenure and his administration. Like you said, it was a repeat election in which one of the biggest competitors had opted out, had sat out, and I think he ran against, was it Dr. Ekuru Aukot at the time? So you could tell that, you know, at that time, it was even the whole idea of requiring legitimacy. But things are different now, considering a Supreme Court affirmation of the win. It's over a year later that this is happening. You have a government that's fully constituted, cabinet secretaries, PSs. I mean, we even have a new budget. We're into the new first financial cycle for the administration. And that's why I'd like us to listen to the President, William Ruto, who is still saying that. And we'll come back and talk about what are really his thoughts, because we've heard from MPs from the central Kenya region who are pouring cold water on this. We've heard from no less than his number two. But this is what the President had to say just earlier at the start of this week.
Jamaa bado wanatuzungusha ati wanatafuta kazi. Ati wanatuzungusha ati tuongee. Ati ndio kazi ipotekane sijui wapi. Ati kazi ya nani? Ati kazi ya nani? Ati nusu mkate sijui nini. Mimi nataka niwaulize nyinyi. Mnataka hii mambo ya tuendelee na mambo ya nusu mkate sijui na sijui nini? Bana hiyo watu nimeambia wakwende kabisa.
And so, of course, the question continues, is this all idle talk? Are they saying, well, obviously giving their own personal views, but, where is their boss? And we see him now making that statement earlier this week. And yet, these are the ones who have sponsored, the people to those talks. The majority leader, earns that position by virtue of being a member of the party and the coalition, has no doubt been sent there with instructions, as has the minority leader, who's been sent there with instructions from, the other side of these talks. And so if we're hearing this from the Deputy President, where does the President lie? And therefore, even if you're saying that they're anchoring this in some form of law, and, the National Assembly and the Senate are speaking about it, are trying to entrench it in some form of law, but at the end of the day, this is a political process, really, more than anything else. The agreements out of there are born out of, political horse trading back and forth. Now, when you have one side going all the way to the top, what's going to happen tomorrow? What's the purpose of the talks if one side is clearly not in favor of the talks themselves or the outcome?
Well, when the President says, nimwambia wakwende huko,
Wapi?
Good question. Is it to the bombers of Kenya? Is it...
Yeah.
Where? Yeah. Because it appears like there's what I would call the clustered messaging. Wherever they go, they have a specific message for a certain region. And you'll understand, because why is Rigathi Gachagua the Deputy President today? Because of the revolt they championed against Uhuru Kenyatta in Mount Kenya region and formed an alliance with William Ruto, and now the President is in State House. And therefore, the President, because he's still a politician, he will need a second term. Therefore, his messaging has to be very clear that nothing should be left in doubt. So that I look at this and feel like it is to sustain a certain narrative so that whatever decisions are taken by the national dialogue, they have to be aligned to that narrative. Because if you look at the agenda of conversation, the Azimio team is proposing, of course, apart from the cost of living, which has been key in their conversations, they're talking about audit of the 2022 presidential election. They're talking of restructuring and reconstitution of the IBC and related matters. That idea of reconstituting IBC is also shared by the Kenya Kwanza team. But as to audit of the 2022 presidential election, there's a divide on that. So even as they do this, I feel it is in an attempt to be able to influence whatever Kimani Ichung'wah team is discussing. But also, knowing Kimani Ichung'wah what he had been doing, it is not, again, it is not idle for him to be sent there. And the Deputy President even says that is why they have decided to send him and Aaron Cheriot to the team. So as we wait to see what transpires, it will also be very important
They meant it as a downgrade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That because the Deputy President was speaking to the region and telling them, we have sent Kimani Ichung'wah as the leader of majority, Aaron Cheriot as the leader of majority at the Senate. You guys, meaning the region, has sent their best son politically, who is Kalonzo Musyoka, and is telling them even if he goes there, he's not going to get anything. But then again, in the agenda of Kenya Kwanza, apart from all those other things, they also want to talk about the position of the Prime Cabinet Secretary and the position of the leader of opposition. So the question is, if that was to be agreed upon by the national dialogue and say that we're going to create the position of leader of opposition, it is taken through the processes that are required, reforming the constitution, and that position is created, who is going to take it? Is it Raila Odinga?
Or is it Kalonzo Musyoka?
Martha Karua, the running mate of Raila Odinga? Is it Kalonzo Musyoka?
Or Opiyo Wandayi?
Or is it Opiyo Wandayi, who is the leader of minority? So there is also the question of strategic positioning by both sides, so that whatever happens and there's something that is shareable in terms of, is it positions, is it goodies, then every region, every person would stand to benefit. But then again, for the side of Deputy President, his keen interest and the region that Mount Kenya is to make sure that they secure. And you've heard him even going to different parts of the country and saying, we got, is it 15 PSs, we got, is it 8 or 9 cabinet secretaries? So he must protect that, because that is what keeps him relevant, at least in Mount Kenya region.
But you know what's curious, though, is you have all this very public lobbying and almost public instruction to their representatives in the dialogue committee on a political campaign platform on one side. But on the other side, it's radio silence. Most of them have been in and out of the country. We haven't heard from Raila Odinga, Martha Karua. Well, Kalonzo Musyoka is now, party to the talks and, a central part of it. Are we to make anything of this? Because literally the president is on a countrywide tour. Where did he start with? And then now he's been in Narok and that region. He's headed to Western Kenya, and he's not just, it's not whistle stops. I mean, it's not parachuting in and out. He's spending a week in each of these regions, and in each of those regions, even though the message is targeted to that region, but it really is, a similar thread, which is, we won the election, we're being driven back in time to history for something that was already settled over a year ago. But then the other side is pretty silent. What do we make of that?
I think it just means that the shape of the agenda is yet to be known. And there's some, as listed, it's still a very thin agenda. And then there's the audit of the election, there's the IBC.
And cost of living.
And cost of living.
Yeah.
Cost of living, which Kenya Kwanza has said you can't have in the agenda. And even in practical terms, it's interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see what kind of suggestions come out of that cost of living suggestion. Because I don't know whether there'll be resolutions to price things a certain way.
Repeal the Finance Act?
Repeal the Finance Act, maybe.
Do away with it altogether? Do it afresh? How does that work?
It was supposed to be that direct then. If it's about the Finance Act, then you talk about the Finance Act.
Yeah.
But the Finance Act actually introduces a number of things that are really, you can say they're different from the challenge of the cost of living. Like the housing levy, you have the new tax rates and all that. We have not had that substantive argument coming from Azimio. We haven't had a structured argument yet coming from Azimio on what they intend to achieve. How about the restructuring of the IBC? What are we going to talk about? How is it going to look like? Are we going to say again, like last time, get 4 representatives and these others get 3? Or 2, and
we get some representing the public, civil society, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes. So I feel it's really still very, very early on these talks, and maybe the game changer would be if these other groups that have been making arguments to be involved, like the religious leaders, the Council of Religious Leaders did speak out strongly and said, we need to be included. There are some other groups, including one civil society group that went to Bomas to try and get included. I think substance may actually come from outside the two political tables than from inside the two. Because the two, that's Azimio and Kenya Kwanza, this is nothing to predict. It's so easy to tell that this is going to happen. They will be stuck on this argument of who won the last election, who lost the last election. Open the server, let's audit the last election. And as we've seen in the whole last 1 year, that can be a conversation that doesn't have an end.
Yeah. And that is interesting. I suppose that's why there's been the request to have these talks televised, although, I'm not sure. There's also a lot of things that happen behind the scenes, and this is different. And I suppose that also comes from, again, history, when nobody knew what was happening behind the scenes. There was, a boycott of certain products at the time. I mean, things were really at their peak, and then suddenly they were not. There were two people on the steps of Harambee House, and they were shaking hands. And so now here this is our second attempt at the talks. They were called bipartisan then. They've been called national dialogue now. As to how national they are in terms of representation, of course, some would say, but the members who are there are members of National Assembly or the Senate and who represent the people. But let's be honest, they are two sides of the political divide who are there attempting to have a conversation on behalf of everybody, and who themselves have failed to reach a consensus of any sort. We've seen, a host of protests, one series of protests, a second series of protests. So how would this be any different from if it was just a closed-door session and people came out and said, we have agreed? Does it make any difference?
I think the biggest problem that the two sides will have to deal with, one is the low appetite of Kenya Kwanza for these talks.
Yeah.
And the other is the weak argument of Azimio for these talks. Because if you're making it about the last election, it's a year down the line. How practical is that? If that's your main argument, there's no turning the clock. So one side has a low appetite for the talks. One side has a very weak argument for the talks.
Yeah, and yet we have a timeline, do we? I recall Raila Odinga saying he hopes these would be concluded by September. That's obviously not feasible at this point, considering tomorrow is, the 25th of August. The month is pretty much over, and tomorrow is when they actually begin the talks. And by the way, we haven't even heard, have they the crystallized ideas that the other technical committee was sitting down to iron out. So in terms of this stretching out...
I think we'll know tomorrow. But recently they spoke about some 60-day period during which this has to be concluded. But I don't think the Senate has passed the motion that recognizes this process of national dialogue. So again, the counting of days may not have started yet. But again, what if the Deputy President is telling the truth? That Raila Odinga, whatever he needed, was sorted in Mombasa. So national dialogue, what dialogue?
Remember, he tells the truth.
He's a truthful man, but then that is quite telling, because if indeed that happened, then the question of what are they talking about arises, and of course it may give credence to the people that have been criticizing and saying that if anything has to happen, then it should be done at the agencies, at the organs, for instance, at Parliament. So we have to wait and see what exactly we are dealing with here.
And even if you were to give it that timeline that they have of 60 days, by the way, Parliament goes into recess, right, for about a month. So this is something that they have to sort of dispense with, before they go into that. So let's assume that that date is actually agreed. And remember, this is not a legal timeline. This is not something that has the word shall and therefore, is compelling it. It's a deadline they have set for themselves, which they could easily adjust based on how the talks go. You can't predict, how soon we could agree. I mean, I would like to say they could agree in less than 60 days, but knowing how things go in this country and how talks go, I would be more inclined to think 60 days, perhaps more. So let's work with that timeline of 60 days. And assuming August is done, so you have September, you have October. And even then, you then have to have a matrix or an appendix, as to, so what happens now? Whatever they agree on, should they agree on something, what is the rollout process for some of those agreements? If it's with the reconstitution of the IEBC, for instance, that's something that will take time. Should they decide that that selection panel that has been sitting somewhere, maybe nowhere, maybe watching and waiting, does that continue? Is that selection panel reconstituted? Is it done away with altogether? Is this committee the one that does it? Do they form a new committee? You see, there's so many things that you then have to, that would be the outcome of those talks, would be the implementer of what is agreed. Let's say they come to an agreement regarding, the cost of living, and hypothetically, in the wildest chance that they decide the finance bill should be thrown out, and, that's a matter that's already in court, the Finance Act. Then what? Do we then put in place a new bill and take it through the motions of Parliament, to considering there's one that is already in place now? If we are auditing, the last election, that's not a process. If they agree to that, that's not a process that would easily take. But you see, all of these would have to happen after the 60 days are concluded. They have some recommendations. Those recommendations are acted upon. Is that feasible, that would even be started and completed in 2023? And yet, time is going. A country must run. Taxes must be collected, projects must be financed, other, of the government must be implemented. And so that's where you start to wonder about what that outcome would look like, what the timelines would be, with respect to the talks.
That's quite interesting, because remember recently, was it last month, there was a report that was presented to the president of the Presidential Working Party on education reforms. And there's a whole matrix of how those reforms proposed should be implemented. Some of them will require legislation. They go up to 3 years. So what if, after the National Dialogue team, they come up with a report that also recommends that it is important to entrench, or is it to embody, the position, to embed actually, the position of the Prime Cabinet Secretary in the Constitution, and to create the position of leader of opposition. So what does that look like? It looks like amending the Constitution. It takes a certain process, which has to also be...
That includes a referendum.
Yes.
Exactly. There has to be a lot of public participation. So in my view, the reason why you have the agenda of Prime Cabinet Secretary from Kenya Kwanza, leader of opposition from Kenya Kwanza, it is not idle, again. This is something they're trying to do, because there are certain things that will take a lot of time. And if you're implementing the product of the National Dialogue, not everything will be implemented at the same time. There are certain things that will delay because of what it takes. In fact, if they agree to create the position of leader of opposition, that may actually be effected in the after the next election, which is 2027. The month will be August. We'll wait and see.
Yeah. So there we are. Tomorrow is the day the talks begin officially. We will know a little bit about how things go. But, just a reminder that we have been here before. We had the bipartisan talks and, we saw them begin and then not. So it's fingers crossed, and we see what happens tomorrow, which is D-Day, and what happens. But it's certainly going to be a long road ahead. On that note, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking about something that was talked about on the floor of the House this week, and it is about one man that the country is talking about, the Cabinet Secretary for Sports. This is NEWSGANG. We'll be right back.